Okay, now let's start the next module, which is Administer Azure Storage. Undoubtedly, Azure Storage is one of that service which is useful for everyone, no matter which role you belongs to. If you're an administrator, developer, or maybe you belongs to any other role, Azure Storage is for everyone. In this module, we are going to focus on Azure Storage with respect to administrative stuff. So let's get started with this. First, we are going to focus on configuring storage account, and then we are going to focus on blob storage. In this particular course, blob storage is going to be something which is going to be covered in depth with Azure files, but we are not going to focus on Azure tables and queues because that's something which is not part of AZ-104 anymore. We are going to focus on storage security also, and obviously after this we have one lab which is associated with Azure Storage configurations. Okay, now let's start configuring storage account. In this module, first we'll focus on exploring Azure Storage services. We'll determine storage account types, what we call kinds also, and then we'll determine storage replication strategies. We'll focus on access storage, and then we'll also focus on secure storage endpoints. All of these are very important concepts. Let's get started with this. First, let's focus on Azure Storage services. Basically, there are 4 different types of data storage services which Azure Storage account can provide. You can have Azure Container, where a massively scalable object store for text and binary data is going to be available. Basically, Azure containers allowing you to store data in the blob format, binary large objects, and literally you can store anything inside that. Whenever you're going to store any file, it's going to be converted into blob. Then you have Azure tables, which are ideal for storing structured but non-relational data. Basically, this is allowing you to store data in a draw column kind of a tabular format, but this is not a DBMS kind of a thing. So it's not like your SQL Server database tables. Then you have Azure Queues, which is a messaging storing solution where you can actually use and store messages for your application specific communication. When you do this thing, different components of application can be communicating using the storage queue messages. And finally, we have Azure Files, which is going to be a managed file share for cloud and on-premise deployment. This is a file share which is based on SMB protocol and is actually allowing you to share your files with your team members or maybe with multiple virtual machines kind of scenarios. As you can see here, when we create a storage account, inside the storage account, we are going to have all 4 types of data. So we can have containers, tables, queues, and files, except you are creating standard storage account with general purpose V2 kind of an option. And that's where we need to see the types of the storage. As you can see here on this slide, we have standard general purpose V2. This is that particular storage account type which provides all 4 types of data storage options available inside that. On the other hand, if you go for premium kind of a storage account, you can get a separate storage account for a blob, a separate for the page blob, and a separate for the file share. Remember, in most scenarios, you are going to focus on general purpose storage, which is going to be a standard performance only. On some kind of extreme scenarios where you want very, very low latency with extreme high performance, you will go with the premium storage account options. Like premium file share is going to be used when you want enterprise level high performance file share applications, or maybe same way you want to use premium high performance page blob kind of a scenarios associated with that. Now, if you go with the premium blob kind of a configuration, you can get scenarios where you have high transaction rates, or maybe scenarios that use smaller objects or require consistent but very low storage latency associated with that. Now, obviously, based on the scenario, you're going to choose different kind of a storage account type, and then based on that, your costing is also going to be different. Let's focus on another important concept, which is storage account replication. Now, there are basically 6 different types of storage replications which are possible. We have single region kind of replications where we have LRS and ZRS. In this case, whatever data you're going to put into that, you are going to get multiple replicas of your data, so that if one copy is not accessible, you can actually use other copies. LRS is going to create 3 replicas of your data in one single region. That's why this can actually help you to protect against disk failure, node failure, or rack failure kind of issues. But if a whole data center or a zone is actually failed, then you cannot access your data. In that kind of scenario, you can go with ZRS, where you're going to have 3 replicas of your data in one single region, but in all 3 zones, the replicas are going to be distributed. This way, even if you are going to have a zone failure or maybe a rack failure or node failure kind of a thing, still your data will be safe because it's stored and copied into another zone of that same region. Sometimes, if you want even better than this, you can go with multi-region kind of scenarios, in which it is going to start with GRS. GRS, which stands for Geo Redundant Storage, is actually going to give you 6 replicas distributed across 2 different regions. You're going to have 3 replicas in the primary region and another 3 replicas in the secondary region, which will be usually 300 miles away. Now, which will be the secondary region is something which is already pre-configured, because every region of Azure is paired with one another region. So basically, you just have to choose the primary region, and secondary region is automatically going to be the paired region of that. Now, when you configure this thing, suppose even if you are getting a regional failure and the whole region with multiple data centers is getting down, then also your data is going to be safe in the other region, which is 300 miles away. If you want to make sure that you want to associate with GRS and then you also want a read access kind of an accessibility associated with that, then you can go with RAGRS, which is basically giving you everything which is there in GRS plus read access available on the secondary region. And that is what RAGRS is all about. Suppose if you want even better than this, then we have something which is a combination of ZRS and GRS, which is known as GZRS. As the name suggests, this is Geo and Zone Redundant Replication Strategy. So basically in this case, you are going to use 2 different regions, and in the primary regions, you are going to use 3 replicas in 3 different zones, and in the secondary region, you are going to have another 3 replicas in the secondary configuration. Now in this case, this is going to do zone specific replication as well as geographical replication both. So you are actually going to get advantages of both in this one. In that case, it is actually going to give you the highest availability possible with the service level agreement of storage account, which is going to be 16 nines. So basically, this is going to be the highest availability ever possible with the storage accounts. Now, in this also, you have a read access kind of an options available. So if you want GZRS with read access available on secondary, you can go with RAGZRS. Now let's focus on accessing Azure Storage objects. Remember, no matter which you are using, container, table, queues, and files, all of these 4 data storage objects are available through REST-based API endpoint. As you can see on this particular slide, you can actually use your storage account name .blob.co.windows.net, which is going to be your base URL, and then you can provide a / and your container names or your respective table names or file share names. Also remember, if you want, you can actually configure a custom domain name also associated with this. Okay, now let's talk about security of an Azure Storage account, in which we are first going to focus on secure storage endpoints. You can configure whether your storage account is going to be accessible on publicly on multiple network, or maybe you want to restrict it to a selected network or IP addresses. Also, whenever you're configuring this, there are firewalls and virtual network restriction access which can be configurable here. And if you want to overcome that, you can also configure network routing associated with that. Remember, subnets and virtual networks must exist in the same Azure region or in the regional pair as the storage account in order to configure this kind of a configuration. So if you have virtual network in one region and storage account is in a different region, that is possible only in case of paired region. Otherwise, it's not going to be possible. Now let's focus on configuring blob storage. Hey guys, sorry for interruption. My name is Maruti and I'm here to make a very important announcement. I hope you are liking our videos and you're doing a continuous learning with us on an Azure Cloud and AI related topics. If you are enjoying this thing, I'm going to announce SkillTech.club, which is our upcoming website, which is going to be launched very soon. We are here to tell you one thing, that everyone who is a subscriber of this particular channel will get Azure Cloud and Azure AI related certification courses free of cost in SkillTech.club. So you will be a part of the SkillTech.club kind of a membership automatically free of cost. And everyone who's a subscriber of this particular channel will get those benefits which are available in that. So what are you waiting for? I request you to please subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends and families if they are also interested in Azure Cloud and AI learning. That's it from my side. Now you can carry on with your learning. Thank you. First, let's focus on implementing a blob storage. As I said, whenever you're going to create a blob storage container, you're going to upload data into this particular container. So the root level, you're going to have your storage account. Inside that, you can create multiple containers, and inside each container, you can upload different kind of files which will be converted into blob. So you can store any kind of unstructured data in this. It can be text, it can be binary data, it can be any other kind of a format. This is also known as object storage because it's actually ultimately binary large object, and that's why we call it blob storage. Some of the common use cases where you can actually use Azure Storage account is you can serve this for images and documents directly to a browser, because a URL is going to be available for each of the blob data which is stored inside the containers. If you want to use it for storing files for distributed access, or you want to use it for streaming video and audio things, or maybe you want to store data for a backup and restore, or maybe for disaster recovery kind of scenarios, or maybe you just want to store data for archiving purpose. In any of the scenarios, blob storage containers will be a perfect choice for you. Sometimes we use this thing for big data analysis also. So when you want to associate this with big data analysis, you can prefer this thing as storing data for analysis by an on-premise or by Azure hosted services associated with that. This screenshot is actually showing you how exactly you can create a blob container. And while creating a container, you have to make sure that you are providing a proper configurable public access level. There are three kinds of access levels which are available: private, blob, and container. Obviously, private means no anonymous access. You're not going to have any kind of anonymous access available on that. If you want to access the data of the blob, then you have to configure SaaS token, or maybe you have to take care of the identity management. On the other hand, if you go with the blob or container level access, you will be getting public access available at either container level or at the particular blob file level. Remember, there are no restrictions of number of containers inside a storage account or number of blobs inside a particular container. So you actually have unlimited containers inside your storage account, and you can have unlimited blob items inside a container. Also, Azure Storage is not coming with any kind of a fixed size. The moment you start uploading data into that, it can expand, it can grow. There is no fixed size associated with the storage accounts. While storing data inside a storage blob account, you have to understand a blob access tier as well. Whenever you are keeping a data inside a blob, it can be belongs to a particular tier which is mentioned here. Suppose if you are going with the default access tier, which is most preferably hot one, then this is something which is preferred for data which is accessed or modified very frequently. Same way, cool tier and cold tiers are actually useful for the data which is infrequently accessed. And then the number of days is something which you have to keep in mind. For cool tier, you have to make sure that the data is stored for at least 30 days. And for cold tier, you have to make sure the data is stored for at least 90 days. And then you have something which is archive, in which your data is most probably going to store for months and months. And then you're just going to keep it there as a storage. You're not going to have a frequent access on the data. In that kind of things, you're going to keep the data in archive storage for at least 180 days or more. Another important concept of blob which you need to understand is lifecycle management of blob. Remember, whenever we are dealing with blob lifecycle management, I always try to relate that with the human lifecycle. Same like in our human lifecycle, which is starting with birth and it ends with death, they are saying that the concept of blob lifecycle management is focusing on blob related data lifecycle. When you upload a data, initially maybe the data is going to be used very frequently, and that's the reason we can actually keep the data in the hot tier. But eventually, when you're going to less frequently use the data, you can move the data from hot to cold and archive tiers. When you do this kind of a movement with the help of lifecycle management rules, it's basically like you are going to shift your less frequently used data into a cheaper tier. That is something which is going to eventually end up in deleting blob also. So basically, transition of a blob to a cooler storage tier to optimize performance and cost kind of a balancing is what lifecycle management rules are actually going to do. We have a storage account replication which is associated with that, and that's why we need to keep in mind that we have a blob object replication also. When you're dealing with blob object replications with multi-region kind of a scenario, this slide is actually showing you that maybe when you try to configure a blob object replication, you can take an advantage of multi-region replication. Now let's say right now we have asynchronous to any other region kind of a replication which is by default there. It's going to minimize latency for read requests. It's going to increase efficiency for compute workloads. It's going to optimize for data distribution, as well as it's going to optimize cost as well. These are all the advantages because of you should actually prefer blob object replication in the first case. Now let's focus on configuring storage security. Now we already discussed that there are multiple ways to secure your storage account. You can maybe use storage service encryption, which is by default enabled in your general purpose V2 kind of a storage account. You can use shared access signature, and you can actually delegate access based on the token generation mechanism with the specific expiration time. You can use authentication with Microsoft Entra ID or role-based access control. So basically you can take care of full authentication and authorization. You can actually use shared key also, which is available in your storage account. So you actually have two different keys available inside your storage account, and those keys you can rotate also as you need. You can use client-side encryption with HTTPS and SMB 3.0 for data in transit. So whenever you're transferring data from one place to another place, you can use this option. Or you can use anonymous access to containers and blobs, and you can restrict that with the help of different access levels associated with that. Finally, last but not the least, you can also use Azure Disk Encryption, because ultimately your storage account is going to store data in your hard drives associated with Azure. So you can actually enable Azure Disk Encryption also. This is a screenshot which is showing you how you can actually create a shared access signature. You can see that when you create a SaaS token, which is a shared access signature, is actually going to help you to provide a delegated access to a specific type of resources. Not only that, you can grant an access to a client without sharing your storage account keys, because they are going to use either key 1 or key 2 as a signing key, and using those keys the token is going to be created. Also, you can control how long the token will be valid and then at which particular date and time it's going to get expired. This service level SaaS delegated access is going to help you to configure this resource in one of the storage services, or maybe you can configure this thing at the storage account level also. This slide is actually talking about the SaaS URL pattern. Now the important thing which you need to understand here is every SaaS token which you're going to generate is actually going to follow the same pattern. Initially it's going to start with the storage account.blob.co.windows.net, or maybe file or maybe queue kind of a URL will be there. After the base URL, you're going to have question mark. And with that, you're actually going to provide multiple parameters associated with that. For example, here we have something which is SP equals to R. Now, SP equals to R is actually going to specify that what kind of a permission you're actually providing inside this. R is something which is like read permission. Then you have ST, which is a starting time, and SE, which is an ending time for this particular token verification. So basically, after this ending time is going to get expired. Same way, you can specify some other parameters also associated with that. And then at the end of this, you are going to have a cryptographic key using which this token is going to be signed. And that key is something which is going to be generated with your SaaS token. Now, other than this, you can actually provide resource type, you can provide expiration time, resources, permissions, IP range, protocols, signature. All of this will be part of your SaaS token. When you want to decode that, it's going to be helping you to do that. Now let's talk about storage service encryption. As we discuss this thing, that this is going to help us to protect our data for security and compliance, and storage service encryption is automatically going to encrypt and decrypt your data. By default, this is going to use 256-bit AES encryption, and remember your storage account is by default going to be encrypted with this. You cannot disable this kind of an encryption. The only thing which you can do is, instead of using Microsoft managed keys, which is a by default configuration, you can go with customer managed keys, and you can actually use your own key associated with that. This is an option by which you can actually enable customer managed keys, and when you do this thing, you can actually use Azure Key Vault kind of a services also to manage your encryption keys. You can create own encryption keys and you can store them in a Key Vault, and then you can also use Azure Key Vault APIs to generate encryption keys associated with that dynamically. Your custom keys are going to give you more flexibility and control compared to Microsoft managed keys, and that's the reason a couple of corporate organizations is actually going to go with customer managed keys. This slide is actually talking about some of the storage security best practices which you have to keep in mind. So I'm not going to read all of this, but I request you to pause this video and just make sure that whenever you want to take care of securities, you're going to keep this thing in mind. Now after Blob, let's focus on configuring Azure files. And in this, first we are going to start with comparing Azure file share with Blob data. One common question which people ask me when comparing file share with Blob data is, where exactly we are going to store data if I want to use it for sharing purpose? Because you can upload any kind of data in Blob containers, as well as you can upload any kind of data in Azure file share also. Well, the answer is on slide. You can see right now the Azure files is actually providing you SMB interface. Basically, it's a SMB 3.0 protocol which is going to be used with that. which is the same thing used by almost all the file share services which are available. So whether you talk about Google Drive, OneDrive, Dropbox, they all are based on SMB, which is perfect for sharing file system with your team members or with your colleagues. Now, when you're doing this thing, it's going to associate with SMB interface. It has client libraries and REST interface also available, which allows you to access from anywhere to those particular stored files. On the other hand, when you go for Azure Blob, this is also having client libraries with REST interface, and it is allowing you to access this unstructured data with the flat namespace, which needs to be stored and accessed at the massive scale in blobs. So remember, this is something which is giving you first difference. When you're associating this thing, Azure blobs are actually giving you access of block blobs, which are going to be massive and which are going to have unstructured data associated with that. Now, whenever you're doing this thing, keep in mind, blobs are going to be perfect when you want to use scenarios like streaming or random access kind of scenarios. Or maybe you want to access application data from anywhere. When these kind of things are there, blobs are perfect. In all other cases, when you want to have a share using which you want to share the files with someone, maybe you're going to use like storing a shared data across multiple virtual machines. Or maybe you're going to store development and debugging tools that you need to be accessed from many virtual machines, or maybe your team members are going to do that thing. Or maybe you're just trying a lift and shift kind of an application to the cloud. In all these kind of scenarios, file share will be the right choice. Whenever you configure a file share is going to allow you to associate with Windows, Linux, and Mac kind of an operating system as a network drive. As you can see in this screenshot, in Windows, if your port number 445 is open, you can directly execute a PowerShell script and you can connect your file share as a separate network drive in any computer or virtual machine. Same is true for Linux and Mac OS. It's going to provide you SMB 3.0 kind of an encryption also configured with that, which is going to make this data sharing secure. Another cool feature of Azure File Share is File Share Snapshot, which is basically helping you to create a snapshot and use it for the backup purpose. It's actually going to help you to protect against application error and data corruption. It can also protect against accidental deletion or unintended changes which can happen in the file share. And it can be configured with backup and recovery services. You can take incremental snapshot that captures the file share state at the point in time, and you can restore it from that particular point in time. And then your snapshots are always going to be created at the file share level, but you can restore that thing at the file level also. And there is always nothing but a read-only copy of your data which is available inside that. So basically, snapshot is nothing but a read-only copy of your data which is always available, from where you can actually restore at the file level. Next, we have a tool called Azure Storage Explorer. This is basically an installable exe which you can download and install in your computer. And when you do that thing, this is going to be one single application which will help you to access multiple storage accounts and subscriptions under one umbrella. You can create, delete, view, edit storage resources, and you can also view and edit blob, queues, tables, files, Cosmos DB storage, and even data lake storage kind of configurations with this. You can obtain a shared access signatures from the storage account keys, and this particular tool is available in Windows, Mac, and Linux operating systems. Now, obviously, if you do not want to use this installable exe, you can actually use Azure Portal also, where you have Azure Storage Browser and Azure Storage Mover kind of applications which are doing similar kind of a thing. So basically, Azure Storage Explorer will be alternative of this kind of tools. After this, we are done with this particular module, so it's a time for doing a lab. Let's get started with the lab of this module.